Hello everyone, I welcome you to CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. This is the second part of the lecture, Short Story, Form and Development. This lecture is part of the series where we discuss the short story, its form, and of course we also discuss different short stories written by different authors at various points of time, right? So in the first half of the lecture we looked at the definition of what exactly is a short story, and we looked at it in comparison to the form of the novel, right? Now from here we are going to move into discussing certain other elements which are important or which actually do come to our mind as we think of the short fiction, right? When the moment you think of short story, there are other two words also which come to mind, which is anecdote and tale, right? Are they the same as short story? Are they synonymous to one another? How is it? Let's look into that, right? So first let's see what is an anecdote. Anecdote is the unelaborated version of a single incident, all right? A single incident which is not elaborated upon, which is just stated directly, right? There is no expansion, there is no explanation. The incident is told as it is. That is what is an anecdote, okay? On the contrary, when we talk about the tale, it is most often called as the story of incident, where the focus of interest is primarily on the course and the outcome of events. So while in an anecdote we just state the incident, in a tale we notice that the focus of the narrative is not just on the incident per se or a single incident per se, but the focus of interest is on the course and the outcome of events, how a certain set of events unfold and what outcome one comes across of those events, right? That's what we mean by a tale and also story of incident. Now you see there is one variation which appears in the tale, which we call as the stories of character. So one is of course the stories of incident and the other is stories of character. We focus here on the state of the mind and the stories of character, right? We here focus on the state of mind and motivation, or on the psychological and moral qualities of the protagonists. That's the whole point about the stories of character, right? That the focus over there is slightly different. It's not on the event, it's not on the incident, but instead it's on the state of mind of the character, or the psychological aspect of the character, or the moral qualities of the protagonist, right? So if these are the ones which are in focus, that forms another kind of a tale. So stories of incident and stories of character, which is part of the tale, and of course anecdote is a simpler version, which is the unelaborated version of the incident. From here we move on to discussing some of the other important aspects of the short story as discussed by Image Abrams. So in our first discussion, we had just established a short story in comparison or contrast to the novel form. Now when we look at it as a standalone element or a standalone entity, what are the points which come to mind? So let's look at them. The first is that the short story writer introduces a limited number of persons, right? So you will never see short story carrying a whole array of characters as compared to its novel form or its longer counterpart, right? Then we also notice that the author cannot afford the space for a leisurely analysis and a sustained development of character as well. So which means what? That the author, he does not have that space for a sustained or a very elaborate analysis of the event which is being discussed, or for that matter even the development of a character. Why is that? Because the space is short. So analysis and character development would also be somewhat precise. It would not carry as much detail as one would say a novel form would carry. So you might wonder that will it be right to say that short story would not carry a lot of insights? Of course not. Sometimes even when you have a shorter space, yet you end up saying things, you end up conveying ideas which are so profound that any amount of elaboration would not do justice to the depth conveyed in just a few words or in just a limited space, right? But what as students of literature we need to understand is that how both these forms of expression have their own unique aesthetic. All right. A third important element of the short story then is that the author cannot develop as dense and detailed social milieu as does the novelist. Again, the same reason. The social milieu can't be as dense and detailed. What do we mean by that? That the social background, the tendencies which were active at that time, the value systems which were influencing people's actions, we cannot see that in as much density and detail in a short fiction as compared to a novel form. It will be there, but again, it will only be suggested. So the detail may not be there as we might find in the longer forms of expression. So that's the third element, that the social milieu may not be as dense and detailed. All right. The fourth thing we say is that the author in a short story often begins the story close to the climax. Now, why is that the case? Because, again, so when the story begins closer to the climax, it means that already there is a point which is suggested by the author, which is going to be the point where your narrative reaches the highest, highest point, or the highest, I would say, occasion, right? Now, the story will actually begin very close to that high point of the narrative. Again, the reason is very clear, right? The next point is that the writer of short fiction also minimizes prior exposition and details of the setting. Prior exposition means that not a lot would be said about what went before the moment which is picked up for representation in the given text. So that prior exposition or explanation will not be there in the form of short fiction. And also, for that matter, even the details of the setting. What went before, what is happening. There might be some references, but it is minimized. That is what A.M.H. Abraham says, right? So you see, when you look at these points close enough, they really help you analyze the short fiction from the point of view of its construction per se, right? Next important point is that your author will keep the complications down. So complications means that different elements come in a state of tussle in the narrative, and there's no clear way forward suggested. So the complications, such complications would of course be there, but then there would not be very many of those in the fiction, in the short fiction, because of course the scope is limited, and lots needs to be said and conveyed in a shorter span, right? Next, we see that the central incident in a short story is often selected to manifest as much as possible of the protagonist's life and character. Again, means what? That it's not that the multiple incidents will give us a view into the protagonist's life, his or her character, the person that he or she is, which is the case in the novel. That you understand the protagonist also, when you see him or her in different situations, different circumstances, interacting with different people, multiple people. But in the case of a short fiction, the central incident is selected to manifest all these things about the protagonist. So it's that central incident then which is directly connected to helping us understand the protagonist's life and character, and not multiplicity of such incidents occur or appear in a short fiction, right? Next, we also say that in a short story, details are devised to carry maximum import for plot development. Now, you see, this is another very important point. The kind of details that one notices in the short fiction, they are used, they are there so that they carry maximum input, they carry maximum significance for the development of the plot, right? That's the other very important element. So the details which are chosen are very carefully chosen for how they contribute to the plot development, and they will be loaded in that sense. So as careful readers of this form, we need to pay attention to details a little more than one might as compared to the longer form, right? So we have noticed these different elements which are crucial to the form of the short story, and we have understood, having defined it, we have looked at its different elements. We now really know what it is, what are the techniques, what are the different aspects which go into the creation of the short story per se. Now from here we come to the development of the short stories, right? Development meaning that when did this form of writing come into being, how did it chart its growth, what were the different developments, or what were the different stages that one can witness in the coming into being of this style of writing. All this is what we are going to discuss next. So the first thing that we say here is that short stories, they date back to oral storytelling traditions which originally produced epics, right? And oral narratives were often told in the form of rhyming or rhythmic verse, often including recurring sections. So short stories then have some kind of a connection to oral storytelling traditions. And these traditions, where people would tell stories orally, they wouldn't be in the written format, were particularly popular, or they were the source of our great epics as well. Be it the Indian epics, or such as the Mahabharata, etc., or be it the Western epics, both have a kind of a history in oral storytelling, and that's where one can trace the beginning of this form as well. Next, we say that in Europe, the oral storytelling tradition began to develop into the written form in the early 14th century. So of course there has to be a tradition, there has to be a transition from the spoken to the written, right? and that's how that is one stage of growth, transitioning from the oral to the written. So in Europe, the oral storytelling tradition began to develop into written form in the early 14th century, and this happened most notably with Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Boccaccio's Decameron. Both these texts are instances of that oral tradition finally manifesting in the written form. And we see that both these books, be it Decameron or Canterbury Tales, they are composed of individual short stories which are set within a larger narrative story or a frame story. Remember, we were talking about it in the previous lecture as well. What is a frame story? Where there's a larger story within which there are these further other shorter component stories. And this was the format followed by both Chaucer and Boccaccio for their fiction. Then of course, moving on from the 14th century and a little later, around the late 17th century is a traditional fairy tales that began to be published, right? Now we see that the appearance of Antoine Galland's first modern translation of 1001 Arabian Nights, which was a storehouse of Middle Eastern folk and fairy tales, right? And also it is the 1001 Nights or the Arabian Nights from 1704, and another translation of it appears in 1710 to 1712. So we see that in the late 17th century, this tradition of the fairy tales gave another fillip to this form of the short story, which was initially in the oral form, came into the written through the likes of Chaucer and Boccaccio, and then of course came the fairy tales, and a very important contribution to this development is that of 1001 Arabian Nights. We all are aware of this. As children, we have come across these stories. And now, talking of closer home, in India, there is a rich heritage of ancient folk tales as well. So from fairy tales, oral tradition, fairy tales, now coming to the folk tales. In India, we have a rich heritage of folk tales. Some of the most famous Sanskrit collections of legends, folk tales, fairy tales and fables are Panchatantra, Hitopdesh and Kathasarit Sagar, and even Jataka tales for that matter. Right? Both of these are those books that almost every child in India would have grown up listening to, or stories from these books are part of the childhood years, right? So folk tales then were another stage of development in the short story as we read it today, right? Now, of course, then after that, after the 17th, 18th century, there was a slight slump which came in the form, and then it's in the 20th century that short story really developed into the form as you and I know of it today. So that is the trajectory that we notice of this form of development or this form of expression, right? Now the last point that we make is here we as we talk about the modern short story, right, as it developed in the 20th century, it's important for us to understand Edgar Allan Poe, the American writer, who is considered to be the originator of the short story as a genre, what he defines the prose tale as. So let's look at his definition. He says it's a narrative which can be read at one sitting and is limited to, and I quote, a certain unique or single effect, unquote, to which every detail is subordinate. So the modern short story as you and I know of it, which came into being in the 20th century, Edgar Allan Poe, the American author, is considered to be one of the pioneers. And he says that it's a form which can be read in one sitting, and it is limited to a certain unique or a single effect which is created by the text, right? And let's further look at another aspect of his definition. He says, and I quote, "In the brief tale, however, the author is enabled to carry out the fullness of his intention, be it what it may. During the hour of perusal, the soul of the reader is at the writer's control. There are no external or extrinsic influences resulting from weariness or interruption." Unquote. So three things are further added by Poe over here. The first thing is, he says that in that short span, the author is able to carry out the fullness of his intention. Whatever that he might to convey, he is able to successfully develop his intention and represent it. Second, he says that the soul of the reader is in the writer's control, which means what? It's a very dense engagement with the narrative because it's a short one. So that's how engaging or gripping it is. And third, he says that there are no external influences which result from the weariness or interruption that might come in the course of reading. So no such influences or external factors kind of come to impact the reader's interpretation. Why? Because of course there is very little scope of interruption, because the reader is expected to finish the reading in one go. So these are some of the elements that Poe defines as important to the short story and the modern form. But of course this theory or this view has been debated a lot, and let's see one such reconsideration which is brought in by the scholar James Cooper Lawrence in his theory, essay, The Theory of the Short Story. Here he questions what Poe does, what Poe has said. Lawrence says, and I quote, "The short story frequently deals with more than one incident, and it does not by any means always produce a single foreseen effect." Unquote. So right at the outset, Lawrence questions Poe's statement that it's not mandatory that a short story will deal with just one incident and it will always have one single effect. But Lawrence is in favor of a multiplicity here. Then he goes on to say, and I quote again, "These facts would seem to lead to the conclusion that any attempt to limit the definition of a short story beyond the statement that it is a brief tale which can be told or read at one sitting is for our purposes inadvisable, if not impossible." So he says that it is inadvisable for us to have this understanding that short story is something which is a brief tale, that it is only based on a single incident creating a single effect. But the only thing that we can stick to from Poe's definition, as Lawrence says, is that it's a brief tale which can be told or read at one sitting. Right? Therefore, from here he goes on to further then of course elaborate upon his idea of short story, where he says that we can talk about short story in terms of stories of fact and stories of fancy. Stories told historically, dramatically and didactically. For him, these become important elements for definition of the short stories. Right? So what we have seen in this lecture is we developed on the definition of short story. We looked at the individual elements of this form of expression. What is it that goes into the construction of this short fiction? And then we focused on the development of this form, how it started from oral storytelling in the early ages, from 14th century broadly stating, then these oral narratives converted into written form. Thereafter, around the 17th century, we see the coming of the fairy tales, and then of course in the closer home in the Indian context we have the folk tales. From there we said that it's around the 20th century that this style of expression really acquired the modern form as you and I know of it. And finally, we talked about Edgar Allan Poe, who's the writer of the modern short story, and what he thinks of the genre. And of course, we also looked at a debate in connection to that. So I really hope that you now have a good sense of what this style of expression is, and you will be urged to pick up a short story and really see that how many elements are you able to locate in that text which we have discussed today. Thank you.